it is a legislative briefing series, as we call it, examining voter access in California's elections and its impact on the changing makeup of the state's electorate. So, session 6 today is the California Voters' Choice Act. We said at 5 years, but really it's at 5 years in counting, because 2018, of course, was the first year that we saw counties adopt the Voters' Choice Act, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. But I want to first just talk about the purpose of the series and where today's discussion kind of fits into that. So, actually, let me just briefly note, I'll give proper introductions when we start our panel, but I am joined today by a set of esteemed panelists, subject matter experts, not only on the VCA, but on elections and elections policy in California. So we've got Russia Chavez Cardenas, which is from she is from the California Common Cause organization. We've got Lei-Sing Sei-Chow, who is from Cali Calls, or California Calls, and then we've got Dora Rose from the League of Women Voters, but again, we'll give proper introductions when we start our panel in a little while. Okay, so the series itself, we've covered automatic voter registration, voter turnout, and representation in the electorate, disparities in turnout and representation, formerly incarcerated, voting and voting rights, redistricting, language access was our last session back in December. And the idea for this series is that it's educational. So we've recorded all of these. It's a library in a sense that's on our website. We recognize that particularly this session, we've got a lot of new members and a lot of new ledge staff. And as we've tried to do these over the years, to varying levels, not counting COVID, of course, we wanted this year to make sure that we kind of came back with a dedicated series that people could come to visit, see in real time, watch later, share the recordings, and hopefully it's a resource for all of you on these different topics. Today's session, like the previous ones, obviously is just an hour. We're not going to cover everything that needs to be covered under the Voters' Choice Act, but we're going to give you a sense of things to be thinking about, a sense of the field, resources, really importantly, that you can review later at your leisure when you're interested, and try to identify the things that are specifically of interest to you. And then most importantly, we have a panel today. And so we're going to leave lots of time for our panelists to talk through from their perspectives where we're at 5 years and counting with the VCA. So just to, still kind of a little more broadly here, some resources generally on all of these topics and more under the elections umbrella. If you're looking for research, information, analysis on election reforms, you can come to my center, Center for Inclusive Democracy, but also, of course, the Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC, UCLA Latino Politics and Policy Institute, the Yanklowitz Center out of UC San Diego, the current population survey data, which is, of course, a product of the US Census, has lots of data on all sorts of topics, but does have data on voting and civic engagement. And then we have data vendors like PDI, Catalyst, and Data for Social Good, who also does all sorts of surveys and working with communities, right? Engaging, learning about engagement and tracking that and understanding that at a deeper level. On VCA research, so I'm just going to give you a brief highlight on some of the main hits in terms of what we understand research-wise on the VCA, but this is where you can get some of this research later. Now, this recording you can view later. The slide deck will be posted as always. We'll send that out. I purposely have put the links in here so you can find them directly. But from my center, we've done a lot of research on the VCA before it even was first implemented. Research on research on vote centers and vote by mail, and a lot of very related topics. But we have specifically done research that was funded by the James Irvine Foundation on the 2018 election cycle. So that first election cycle, those first 5 counties, what the impact was, and that was a series of reports. Done research, doing a deep dive into San Mateo County's adoption of the VCA, both in 2018 and 2020. We were one of the research centers that that collaborated with the Secretary of State's office on the official VCA reports that are required as part of the VCA. So we did a series back in 2020, or series looking at the 2020 election cycle, excuse me. And then we have other VCA-related research, and that's that last link. And then PPIC, Public Policy Institute of California, has put out research led by Eric McGee, who's our senior policy fellow in this area, Particularly of interest is equity and voter turnout after pandemic election changes. That report is not exactly looking at the VCA, it's looking at vote centers, which is very related, equity and equity impacts of consolidated or consolidation of polling places, more specifically. And then if you want to see those official reports that are required as part of the VCA, built into SB 450, the actual bill that was adopted by the legislature, you can go to the Secretary of State's website. Their office has a page that has all of the reports leading back to the first report on the 2018 election cycle. That was done by the Center for Election Innovation and Research. Then our reports by Caltech, UCLA reports, and then the official reports that the SOS recently has been putting out that are on specifically their analysis of the VoteCal records. So that's essentially our registration database, right, in California. So lots of things, lots of places you can go. There is the latest report, which is not from a research center or the official SOS, but it's actually from a steering committee, a collaboration of voting rights groups, civic engagement groups in California, funded by the Haas Jr. Fund and Silicon Valley Community Foundation. They came together, and I also helped advise the work that they did, but they created a report that was a product of their thinking and their analysis, looking at this question of not just where we're at with the VCA, but looking at the impact potentially of the VCA on turnout and representation and access and voter education. So one thing to keep in mind with the VCA, when it was going through the legislative cycle, and I know our panel will talk about this a little later, so just briefly here, people came to the table for all sorts of different reasons, right? There was a lot of interest from advocacy groups, community groups, voting rights groups, wanting to see at least a driving reason for many of them was hoping that the VCA would be impactful positively on voter turnout disparities, right? Opening up access, increased turnouts, but also increased turnout hopefully for everybody, right? By providing more ways and more days to vote, but also would address disparities in participation and access. And that's what this report is particularly focused on. This is the report itself, and QR code if you're interested, and grab it later too. But I made it really big to make it easy. I'll give you a second. I don't know about you guys, but I still struggle with the QR code. I gotta get it. Yeah, and your people in the back. All right, hopefully you got it. You can get it later too on the recording. All right, and then lastly, in terms of resources, our center, since way back in 2018, we created something called the Voting Location and Outreach Tool. We've changed the name over the years. But we were looking at, with our way through data, that we could assist the decisions, because a big foundational piece of the VCA is you're moving from neighborhood polling places, one per every 1,000 registered voters in a precinct, now to many fewer voting locations, vote centers that are open up to 10 days. Anyone in a precinct, anyone in a county can use it. You're not married to your local center. Lots of services and resources, but there still are fewer, right? And how do you make the decision? How do election officials equitably cite these now fewer numbered, right, but open longer vote centers? And so we created this tool for the first 5 counties in 2018. It's expanded to all of California, whether you're a VCA or not. It's actually expanded across the country as well, informing equitable citing of voting locations. So that's available for people. And then there's one specific to LA County that isn't about identifying equitably placed voting centers through a facility allocation model, but rather it tracks voter turnout in real time over the election, early voting period in the election and throughout election day. And it helps people identify where to mobilize, move people around, move resources around. It also tracks the use and the volume of vote centers and so forth. I'll stop there because of time, but okay. So if you didn't know, just a tiny little bit about the Voters' Choice Act. So again, first counties, the first 5 adopted in 2018. I'll show you a map in a moment, replacing neighborhood polling places with vote centers that you can use county-wide, up to 10-day, 4-day, and 10-day, 4-day and 11-day vote centers. Any voter can use that. And at the time, when it initially started, only vote centers would mail every registered voter automatically a vote-by-mail ballot. Of course, now that has gone statewide in California, right? But very importantly, the VCA requires a certain level of outreach. The counties conduct outreach to community members to educate them about the voting changes in their county, to encourage them to use the new voting options, establishes required VAC and LACs, voting accessibility advisory committees, and language accessibility advisory committees to advise the counties for these groups, right, on equitable access. There's many more details here in terms of what the VCA requires. All the reports that I mentioned to you, to some degree, have background on all of that. Here's the map just saying that now we were 5, and then we were 15 in 2020, and then we were 27 in 2022, counties adopting, and now 2 more, Humboldt and Placer, have declared that they're going to adopt in 2024. 29 counties. We're way past a majority of California's registered voters that are living in a county that is a VCA adopting county. Okay. Highlights really quickly, and then we'll move on to our panel. So forgive the speed. I've got a little bit more text on here for people that want to review later. So this is really, these are highlights from a collection of all of our different voting reports over the years, particularly recent reports, recent research that we've done with a variety of research methods. So statewide representative surveys of voters, surveys of community groups and voting rights groups and anybody, almost anyone in the elections field, county elections officials, elections offices, in-depth interviews with select offices as well as organizations, in-depth analysis of the voter file, and so on. So I'm kind of pulling it together here for these purposes now. So some of the findings have been that there's a strong infrastructure, mechanisms for public engagement and accountability. These are the advantages of the VCA that we see and that we've heard people talk about in their experiences, right? That a recognition that there's flexibility in voting that the VCA gives, more ways, more days, right? You have 4 options to drop off your vote by mail ballot. Well, 3. Mail, drop it off at a drop box at staff, drop it off at a standalone drop box, or you can still vote in person, right? Election officials report more public input is helpful. They like it. Organizations will also report that when that has been done, when that input has been provided, that typically it is listened to and adhered to, right? Or at least gets into the process when developing what's called an election administration plan, also something that's required by the VCA. Counties that adopt the Voters' Choice Act have to establish these. Election officials will tell us that vote centers are easier to staff, fewer problems reported at vote centers during the weekend before or on election day. We did hear, though, from many community groups, right, and even election officials themselves, that there's a wide variety in the quantity of input in those election administration plans, and a wide variety, maybe even by some account, the quality of the content as well, right? A lot of groups weren't aware that the EAP was something that they could contribute to. Outreach was limited, some varied quite significantly by county in terms of how they outreach to groups. Of course, counties also differ significantly in the types of groups that are available and the number of groups that are available, right, to engage with. Many groups want to engage if they do know, but maybe they don't have the resources or the time because they're fighting other battles, that sort of thing. So the infrastructure still hasn't been fully utilized to know if the VCA could be utilized to help close those gaps. So in a sense, the question around those turnout gaps, have we really seen kind of a fair look at it or take at it, because not everybody still is fully participating in the VCA, if that makes sense. And we also know from voter surveys, election cycle after election cycle now, overwhelming majority of voters do not know that there have been changes in their counties, right? And so they may be changing a voting mode on the fly for a variety of reasons, but they don't necessarily know that there actually are a series of new options that are available to them. And so the numbers that we're seeing in terms of the changing voting behaviors are not necessarily informed by a fully aware electorate. Like, if they knew everything, would we see different kinds of, right, potential for different behaviors if they knew all of their choices? Stakeholder surveys and interviews revealed that the mechanisms for public engagement and accountability are being underutilized. So feeling like there are a lot of aspects of the VCA, particularly around the EAP, but other aspects as well around outreach requirements that we're not seeing fully adhered to, and there's not a lot of accountability about it. Lots of reasons why we see that in counties. This is just kind of a blanket statement here. Counties, especially more recent VCA adopters, are not as engaged with organizations, or at least some of them. that do specifically group with historically underrepresented or marginalized voters. This is challenges here again. There's a lack of public awareness of EAPs, as I mentioned, a lack of clarity and transparency in how outreach dollars are being spent. So you gotta spend your outreach dollars. There's been public funding, right, particularly around the pandemic. But what does that look like? How do we track it? How do we know if it's been successful? That has been very confusing to access. And I'll say as a researcher, being able to get that from a county for a variety of reasons is difficult, right, in terms of how they track it and so forth and what's available. Lack of accountability for county voter outreach plans and spending. I already said that. Okay. Impact on eligible voter turnout. Now, a reform like this, I have said over and over again in our research reports, is very difficult to disentangle for so many other reforms that are happening at the same time in the context of the last few election cycles. We don't have any evidence at this point to say clearly in any way that the VCA has positively impacted turnout and reduced disparities, the VCA itself, right? And we don't have any evidence to say that it's hurt. There is some research around consolidation, but not the VCA itself. But what we do know is just factually, disparities in turnout by race, ethnicity, age continue, and they're still quite substantial, right? They are entrenched, and with the presence of the VCA, we haven't seen that removed. Again, not necessarily a causal, right, connection that we can make at this point. So participation gaps persist across VCA and non-VCA counties, across elections from, for instance, 20 to 22, white turnout dropped 21 points, but Latino turnout dropped 38 points, Asian American turnout dropped 34 points, and Black turnout was down 29 points, and those are data from the Public Policy Institute. And we also know that in-person voting is still a critical option. The last couple election cycles, 2020 and 22, we saw about 13% of all ballots cast be in person, right, at a polling or vote center. Slightly higher in person in a VCA county. But that might not sound a lot, but there are variations by group. So it's higher for young people, higher for Latinos in-person voting, much higher in LA County. There's still statewide about 17% of all ballots cast that are at a staffed drop-off location. Some voters, that just happens to be the closest drop box, but some voters from some of our in-depth research we know are very specifically choosing a staffed drop-off location. They need to double check something in a language, right? They need language access. They want to make sure that they've signed it. They want reassurances that it's going to be safe and gets to its location, a variety of reasons. In-person drop-off, I said 17%. If you combine that 17% of, again, the proportion of all ballots cast, right, in the last couple of elections that were at a drop-off staff location, and you combine the 13% that are in person, you get to be like almost 30% of people that are using vote centers, right, in some way, or polling places, a staff location in some way. Make sense? So we still have people going to places, right, to a voting center or a polling place. Almost 20% of Latino and 18% of Black voters dropped off instead of a drop box. Okay, at a location instead of a drop box. Voter outreach and education, this is my last slide here. Both election officials, voter engagement orgs that we've talked to over the years and recently in our kind of more comprehensive look, identified the lack of funding for outreach and education as a significant barrier around the VCA. Again, stated requirements around the VCA. And then also just more to talk about, right? If you're doing mobilization in a community, whether you're thinking about the VCA or aware of the VCA a whole lot, the VCA is intertangled in your work because you are going to explain all of those options, right, around voting in your county, for instance. Voter engagement orgs expressed frustrations that EAPs lacked specificity and outreach strategies to reach the most marginalized voters, and we saw that in our own content analysis of EAPs in the last few years. Wide variety of just how much historically underrepresented groups were discussed and what those outreach strategies look like. And again, lots of details around there that I'm skipping right now. When surveyed about how they target outreach to mobilized voters, election officials largely reported using the same outreach strategies used for the general population. We also know election officials quite honestly said that when they do outreach engagement targeted to voters of color or other historically marginalized groups or both folks with disabilities or language access needs, some didn't do a whole lot of it, but when they did do it, many said that they didn't actually know if they were reaching those groups. They didn't have the ability to be able to track that and understand And it wasn't required, right, that they track that and understand that. So they're doing education and outreach, but how effective it is or what its reach is still mostly unknown in these counties. So it's not that it's not effective, it's that we just aren't able, it isn't being measured, right? Okay. A majority of voter education or engagement orgs reported that they did not do VCA-specific outreach. Instead, they emphasized the importance of voting, like all the other things that they're funded for or need to do, regardless, if it was a VCA county or not, and trying to figure out what components of the VCA they had to talk about. Like, would they talk about just your more ways, more days? But they would never talk about EAPs, for instance, right? They're underfunded. They've got specific goals that are very, very important, and maybe the outreach that they're receiving, right, around again organizational level around the EAP is not a whole lot, and so they end up not engaging, right? Okay, ladies, please go ahead and come on up. Sitting on your far left, everyone, we have Russia Chavez Cardenas, who is from the California Common Cause organization. Russia brings about 15 years of experience in public policy and advocacy. She's their voting rights and redistricting program manager. She was previously the senior vice president of policy and government affairs at Community Health Councils in Los Angeles and deputy secretary for budget and finance at the California State Transportation Agency in Sacramento. Russia is now based in LA and will be taking over the work in LA redistricting, implementation of the Voters' Choice Act, election protection, and other projects pertaining to voting rights and redistricting for California Common Cause. Just a light plate.
Yeah, big job.
Just a light plate. That's what I hear them saying.
Save democracy, Russia.
Okay. Next in our distinguished panel here is Elisang Seichao, who is with California Common Cause. She's their policy and campaign director. She leads their policy research and development to run campaigns that create structural change in lives of low-income Californians, born and raised in a toxic hotspot in Richmond, California. She realized the deep inequalities that existed in her community. They inspired her to get a degree in politics and international relations with a focus on power and justice from Scripps College in Claremont. That's a pretty cool major. Claremont, California. Prior to joining California Calls, she was the political director at the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, where she led civic engagement teams that mobilized Asian American voters in language around progressive issues. Thank you. And now on to Dora Rose. Dora Rose is the Deputy Director for the League of Women Voters.
Deputy Secretary of State, you didn't know that.
For the League of Women Voters of California, she joined the staff in 2015 as the Senior Director of Civic Engagement. In that role, Dora spearheaded civic tech work on Voters Edge California, the implementation of the Voters' Choice Act, and the successful adaptation of best practices designed to make official voter information clear and comprehensible. In her current role, Dora directs the League's work on both advocacy and education. She is, I think there's a little bit of a printer blip or something there, but through legislation and ballot measures. On the education side, she works to cultivate an informed, empowered, and more representative electorate. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dora. Okay. All right. Now, on to the questions. All right. So, Dora, I'm going to open up with you.
Okay.
So,
Is this live?
we're good.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, they've got it covered. So, we're here today talking about the VCA, right? And I opened with a short introduction of what the VCA is. Why was the VCA first made law in California? Please give us a sense of this, the type of conversations, discussions, debates that were occurring around the VCA when it was first introduced as a bill.
Sure. So I'm actually going to go back to 2014, where I was relatively new to the state, and I was working with the ACLU and the League of Women Voters on putting into place a series of Secretary of State candidate forums during the primary. And the focus of these forums was indeed California's very low overall participation rate in the 2012 general election, I think it was 57%. We were 43rd nationally in terms of voter turnout. That's voter turnout overall. And then, of course, there was this very persistent participation gap where voters of color and young voters were turning out at, I think it was something like 20 percentage points or so less than the general public. So it was a significant problem. We asked a lot of questions at these debates about the problem. And then candidate Alex Padilla, in these debates, promised to do something about this issue if he gained office. And indeed, he did gain office. Yeah. And it was a focus of his administration. He went to work right away. There were ideas already out there in the field. Neil Kelly was Registrar of Voters in Orange County, and he was president of CACEO, California Association of Clerks and Elections Officials at the time. He had the idea of importing some innovative concepts from Colorado related to voting. They had in Colorado pioneered sending a ballot to every voter, having these vote centers, having drop-off locations, and it seemed like sort of, the next best thing in terms of modernizing voting. Dean Logan, at the same time in LA County, was working on his own modernization efforts and had some of the same ideas. All of this intersected. And of course, Senator Allen was willing to take up the charge in the Senate with SB 450. And they presented these ideas in bill form. Now, advocates, while looking similarly for a solution, were really concerned about the initial drafting of the legislation. And to everybody's credit, when the advocates expressed their concern, and I'll talk about those concerns in a moment, everybody rolled up their sleeves. The legislators rolled up their sleeves, Secretary of State's office rolled up their sleeves, local elections officials rolled up their sleeves, and good government organizations coming out of a group called the Future of California Elections, which was created to do collaborative work between elections officials and voting rights advocates to try to improve California's elections, all got together, and probably Ethan and certainly Darren Chesson, who was at that time head of the Committee on Senate Elections, and probably Nicole as well, got together and tried to figure out how to really improve this bill so as not to come up against some of the problems that were being raised. So let me just sort of go through some of these problems that we were looking at, and some of the reasons the Voters' Choice Act turned out the way it did. The reduction of in-person locations, which Mindy mentioned, there was a real concern that getting rid of everybody's neighborhood polling location and opening up these vote centers, which were many fewer and far between, would be very disruptive to communities who simply liked being able to access their neighborhood polling locations, were used to that, were sort of acclimated to that. People with disabilities who would have trouble accessing voting locations that were further away, this vote center idea. People who would have to pay, right? It was almost a poll tax to have to pay to take a bus or to park to get to your voting locations. These were big concerns. So when in the negotiations for the bill, we worked very carefully on determining that there needed to be extended hours and extended days to compensate for fewer locations, to make sure that these centralized voting centers would be available over a period of time. And ensuring that the vote centers and drop boxes also were placed in a way that would accommodate most communities. So if you look at the legislation, you'll see a long list of considerations that had to go into the placement of drop boxes and voting location and vote centers. They had to be close to mass transit. They had to be close to communities with historically low vote by mail usage to try to make sure that those communities would have easy access to in-person voting. They had to be close to communities with language needs. The list went on to try to accommodate our already underrepresented voters to make sure we didn't exacerbate the participation gap, right? We certainly didn't want to make it worse. We wanted to use this tool to make it better. Advocates were also concerned that an increase in mail voting could also result in an uptick in rejected vote-by-mail ballots. Vote-by-mail is not a panacea. It has got to be put into place with a great deal of care and attention to ensure that people know how to use those vote-by-mail ballots, right? And people whose primary language wasn't English, we already knew were disproportionately impacted by vote-by-mail ballot rejections. Now, this was addressed, but not until 2018 legislation that was passed to institute a statewide notice and cure process, which is a great and good thing. And that was actually inspired by a 2016 ACLU lawsuit regarding vote-by-mail ballots. Sometimes that happens. We get the lawsuit, then we get legislation to address the results of the lawsuit. And also later, the Secretary of State, and I think this was in 2020, issued these really well thought out regulations about how to do signature matching in a way that reflected best practices around signature comparison, comparing people's signature on that mail ballot to the signature that was on file without unnecessarily rejecting ballots that were valid. So we saw this decline, and I was talking to Mindy about these statistics recently, in rejected vote-by-mail ballots in 2020, and that was really hopeful. We thought, okay, this is working. We put into place what we need to put into place to avoid too many rejected vote-by-mail ballots. But in 2022, there's a huge uptick in rejected vote-by-mail ballots. We don't know why. We have to figure it out. We have to address this. It sort of points to the fact that this is an iterative process, and we are constantly on the lookout, constantly watching. The advocates also brought to the table this idea of a voting access advisory committee to address issues related to people with disabilities, language access advisory committee to address issues related to people who had limited English proficiency. That was baked into the Voters' Choice Act. You could not be a Voters' Choice county without having those two committees. And the idea was that those two committees would help make sure that this process was going to work for those populations. And there were also requirements to engage the public in the development of the election administration plan, which Mindy was talking about. And that would be broader than people from the LAC and the VAC. It would involve the community in general, commenting on things like vote center placement, but also on things like media, the best media placement for their communities, make sure that the messaging was getting to the right places. The work of all of these advocates resulted in the Secretary of State task force being required, which would allow us to monitor the rollout. That was in place for a couple of years. It has been dormant for the last few years, and it's actually being revived by the Secretary of State's office. I don't know if anyone's here from the Secretary of State, but it is being revived, which is a great and good thing. I just want to mention that one big issue when SB 450 was rolled out is that it did not include postage paid on vote-by-mail ballots. That was a huge problem. Obviously, another sort of poll tax issue, right? It's an equity issue not to be paying for those ballots. We finally did get postage paid on every vote-by-mail ballot in legislation that I believe was passed in 2018. So that's a rather long way of getting to the fact that getting to where we need to be with the Voters' Choice Act and it's sort of having all the pieces in place to make sure that it's successful has been a very long and winding road. It is iterative. It is continuing. We're not done yet. It involves collaborative work among all of those folks that I talked about. It's a work in progress. And that's sort of the history, soup to nuts.
And really just the bare description of the history. There's so much detail there. I would like to just lift up what I think you said too, that so much of what is in the VCA today, right? The final product of the bill itself, SB 450, was a negotiation and an agreement by outreach organizations, community organizations, voting rights organizations, and to get support, right? Yeah. Many of these elements were adopted. Yeah. And so it's just important As we go forward, there was also a lot of discussion that there could be changes, right, in the future. But as changes are discussed, it's just to remember that many of those elements of the VCA that may come up for discussion were elements that were hard fought, right? And a lot of thinking and negotiation went into those elements. So something to think about, yeah.
Yeah, they were hard fought, but it was also kind of a model of collaborative work among all of the constituencies to try to get it right.
Yeah, hard work. How about that? Maybe that's a little better. Okay, thank you. Next question, and I'll start with Lai Thang. How does your organization engage with the VCA? Of course, again, your California Common Cause, or California Calls, looking at Russia. You were out there doing mobilization and voter outreach across the state, highly effective in your work, talking to voters all the time, engaging voters. What do you do around the VCA?
Yeah, so I think for California Calls, we talked to about 1.8 million voters. I think that's how many we've talked to date. And we do this year round. We see elections as not just being for the election, but really year round engagement. So people are knowledgeable, informed, and engaged and want to be a part of our democracy. And we do this in 8 languages throughout the state. So, we have partners who are in Sacramento, on the Central Coast, in Central Valley, to LA, all the way to San Diego and throughout the state. And for us, the VCA has really kind of shifted how we do civic engagement work. Before, we used to do GOTV like right up until the election, and now it's like the week before ballots drop, we're already talking to voters about, hey, you're gonna get this mailer, don't lose it. Here's the information around like all the polling locations, where to vote. And a lot of the times our groups are some of the only partners that are talking to low income or communities of color around elections. A lot of the times they're not being reached out to by traditional parties and are largely kind of left out of our democracy. And for California Calls, we know how important trusted messengers are, both in language and culturally competent in ways that really bring people in. For us, there's so much education that we do, where is your polling location? A lot of people have questions about this, and sometimes it changes from year to year. And so it may not be the same place that they remember from the last election cycle. There's a lot of questions around the signature piece and even confusion around the postage. People still think they have to put a postage on it. And so there's a lot of education that needs to happen. And I think for us, there's areas where there are civic deserts where, there isn't a lot of infrastructure to do this voter engagement. Registrars of voters don't have as much capacity to do this with marginalized communities. And so I think that that's a huge need. And then, there's another portion around people needing that information to feel like, hey, I can participate. I know what's going to be happening this election cycle. I know what's on the ballot. I know, where to drop this off. And I'll say the other component for California Calls is for a lot of low income and communities of color, there is a lot of disinformation and misinformation targeting these groups. And so for us, that can really erode at this idea of democracy. And for us, we talked to some voters and they were actually terrified of dropping off their ballot at a ballot drop box because they had heard rumors that they were gonna be lit on fire. And so they wanted to go in person to really share this ballot and be able to make sure that it was counted. And so I think that those are some of the issues that we're tackling as grassroots groups and when we're talking to voters on the phone. And we know also that there's a huge housing crisis in California. For a lot of our voters, they've had to move, they've had to, go to other regions, they're having to live with a family member, they haven't updated their address. And so there are a lot of questions around just how to even get a ballot or get it replaced. And so that's some of the pieces that I think on the day-to-day can seem really small talking to voters, but can make a really big impact in helping them feel engaged and actually participate. So yeah, I'll pass it on.
Thank you very much. Resha, what about California Common Cause?
So at California Common Cause, we do a couple of things. So we are monitoring VCA implementation as new counties come online. So we're always monitoring those counties, watching and observing how they're implementing. And then another thing that we're also doing is as counties update their plans, the EAP plan, we'll work with local organizations like Cali Calls or other CBOs in the area and do some education around there. So over the summer, Riverside County, for example, was updating their EAP. And there was a host of civic engagement or GOTV organizations who were either unaware of the EAP update, who were unaware of the plan. And so what we did is we would take our information, we would study the EAP just like we would for ourselves, and then we hosted a series of like informative workshops for them and then walk them through the EAP. This is what's in the EAP. This is what the criteria is requiring. Do you have any questions? This is how you can engage with your local registrar of voters so that you can weigh in on what the implementation of the VCA would look like. This summer, that went over very well with a number of CBOs to get those really hard to reach and marginalized communities engaged in the process. We also found out and we also heard that those local registrar of voters were receptive to that information, and a lot of those recommendations that the CBOs were able to provide to the registrar of voters was included. I think what we noticed through that experience, or what I observed through that experience, was that there has to be someone in the middle doing that implementation middle work. A lot of the work that Callie Calls is doing, or some of that work that we're doing, to ensure that organizations are aware of this process, are familiar with what the VCA is, and helping them like peel back the layers so that they can start to integrate and participate in the process.
Thank you. Nora. League of Women Voters.
So in the early days, we worked with Future of California Elections to develop a lot of collateral, both educational material for elections offices. This is a complicated bill, right? And we felt that it was necessary to break it down into a checklist. So if anyone wants this checklist, it's still out there. I think it's really underutilized, but it's still out there. To allow the elections offices to ensure that they were really hitting every aspect of the election administration plan and other elements of the VCA. So we thought that simplifying it for elections offices would be important. And we also created collateral material for education, sort of plain language, because the League of Women Voters does a lot of work around plain language and testing to make sure that the language is plain messaging so that voters would really understand the changes that they were about to encounter. That was the earliest work that we did, and we did in conjunction with Future of California Elections. We got grant funding in the early days in the pilot program to train the trainers. And we actually broke up into groups, and I worked with Jonathan Mehta-Stein, who was at that point with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and Fred Neeson from Disability Rights California. And the three of us went on the road. And we went on the road to Napa County, San Mateo County, and Nevada County. And we went there to train the trainers. We went there to train community-based organizations, both as to what the VCA did and how to work with their members on doing the kind of analysis and assessment of the EAPs. So we would actually convene these big work groups, and we'd have 50 people in a room sitting with a draft EAP, going through it and making their comments. That kind of granular work requires funding. It's really intensive work. It was really useful. We found out of that work, for example, that it's a terrible idea to have a vote center or a drop box next to a sheriff's office, because folks feel extremely intimidated by going to vote at sheriff's offices, especially people whose lives have touched the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system in some way. So there are sort of learnings that came out of that early on that we were then able to feed around the state to other elections offices about best practices. And we also developed the idea of the VIOC, because while there was a language accessibility advisory committee and a voting accessibility advisory committee for people with disabilities, there was no catch-all group to advise the elections offices as to the needs of other underrepresented groups. So this concept of the Voter Education and Advisory Committee became something that I really believe is a best practice, and it was used, for example, in San Mateo to great effect. And it continues to be something that they're using in San Mateo County. And then we're involved in the Secretary of State Task Force. What the task force used to do was review all of the EAPs and give advice, and you were on that task force as well, and give advice as to how to improve the EAPs. We'd send them back down to the counties saying, you didn't hit this box on our checklist. You've got to, make sure you get that community engagement and get them to give you advice about the media outlets that might be best for their community. So that task force, which went away for a little while, was extremely useful. Then in 2020, we pivoted to working with our local leagues and giving them advice as to how to manage implementation in their counties. And one really important thing that we told our local leagues was that you need to assess your county to see whether the VCA is a good idea there. Do you already have high levels of vote by mail ballot usage? Is this going to work well for your county? Is your county going to be able to commit the resources, the money necessary to do the proper kind of education and outreach? So we didn't endorse the VCA entirely. We said the devil is in the details. You got to look at it carefully. And so we've sort of shifted to that statewide guidance at this point instead of going into counties themselves. And then at the state level, we do the same thing alongside Common Cause, reviewing the EAPs, giving advice to counties as to how to approve them, making sure that they are implementing the law correctly. And that's tough, because a lot of the EAPs that we see are, to be honest, deficient and really need to have work done on them to make sure that they are engaging the community in all the things that they need to be engaging the community on. And now the task force is being revived, and we'll be on that again, and we'll continue that kind of monitoring.
Thank you very much. So now that we are at 5 years and counting, do you think, and this is for each of you, and give us maybe a couple of minutes from each of you on this question, but do you think the VCA has met its goals? I will say at the outset that one of the things we found in our research is that your expectations, your goals for the VCA, right, vary significantly from where you stand, right, from election officials to, of course, community groups, advocacy groups, people fighting, working hard, working together around the VCA. Sometimes can be talking past each other because they have different goals, right? So in terms of the goals that you and your organizations have had around the VCA, do you think it's met its goals?
I think I'm
I'll
yeah, for California Calls, I think our hope and our dream goal really is that, and I don't think the VCA is the silver bullet. It's not going to be the only thing that accomplishes this, but I think for us, our goal and hope is that really we close the participation gap. I think the VCA has made it more accessible and inclusive in some ways, but there are a lot of other needs to be able to accomplish this. And so for California Calls, when we see the statistic of 21% of white voters, that percentage drop. But then for Latino voters, I think it's 38% drop. That's a huge gap. And we know this gap has existed for a long time. And I think that that's what we're hoping to do as grassroots community groups is really close that, because we can't really have a representative democracy if there are a lot of people who are both not participating and there's still a huge portion of people who aren't even registered to vote. And so there are very big consequential policy decisions happening at the ballot box, and so we know how critical it is for low-income Californians and voters of color to participate in this process. And so I would say that's the dream. I think in the interim period, some of what the hopes and dreams and what I think successful implementation would look like are these partnerships across both government, across community-based organizations and philanthropy. For community-based organizations, we're already doing this voter outreach, but a lot of the times this isn't necessarily in coordination or is supported by state government. A lot of the times we're working with philanthropy on this, but I think it's going to take all of us to really actually achieve this and close that participation gap. And a lot of the times we don't know what's happening with the EAP process. A lot of these folks doing the field work know what's the best way to get into a neighborhood. They know the best places where a voting center could be and be the most inclusive. I think also just the information that they're able to provide to the voters, that's going to be really critical. And a lot of the times these elections officials, they don't have all of the capacity nor the resources to do all the work. They can't reach every every language. They can't reach every constituency. And so I think that those partnerships are really critical. And for me, that's kind of what I think successful VCA implementation looks like, is like more of these partnerships across the state. I know some, cities and jurisdictions are doing it better than others. And I think it's also the funding piece. We are facing this budget deficit, and a lot of things are going to get cut. And we always talk about democracy as being one of the most important issues. And also it's highly underfunded. We know that voter education is really critical. A mailer isn't just going to be the only thing that's going to turn out a low-income, infrequent voter out to vote. And so for us, there's going to be a lot of different strategies required, whether that's talking to them, in the field, whether that's, social ads to be able to reach them. A lot of people are getting their information through social media now. So I think that those are some of the things I see as successful implementation and where we could go.
Great, thank you.
When I go back and think about what successful implementation will look like I go back to some of the original bill analysis and what was the legislature really thinking and analyzing as they were considering structuring the bill. And a couple of things come out, and that was one, they're really looking at this Colorado model. Like, what is Colorado doing to get really high voter turnout? The other part of those original analysis was closing the voter participation gaps. As Dora mentioned, the legislature was really grappling with how voters were showing up, the lack of turnout, and so they were thinking about how do we use the VCA to do a couple of things. Do we think about adopting this Colorado type model, and will this help us address voter participation gaps? So I'm thinking successful implementation can have a couple of prongs on what we're already doing, right? We have these EAP plans, and I do think that there is an opportunity in those EAP plans to figure out how we can better work together to ensure that the communities are weighing in, and to ensure that folks know what needs to go into an EAP. How is the criteria being defined? How are individuals going to really weigh in and provide what impact that implementation is going to have on them? And I also think that the VOC that Dora mentioned, not a lot of counties have, not every county has one, because that's not an explicit requirement in the VCA, the LAC and the VAC.
Voter Education Outreach
Committee. Advisory Committee. VOC. Another acronym we don't need.
In San Mateo County.
So San Mateo County has them, but not all of the counties have them. So I'm thinking about how do we really think about the other low propensity marginalized voters, and thinking about how we integrate them into this process are ways we would, improve upon the VCA.
Thank you. Dora.
I feel like we're all preaching from the same hymn book here. I mean, we are very much in agreement on these issues. I would say, in terms of whether it's working, it's too soon to tell. Yeah, I think we really do need to give it some more time. I think, unfortunately, the pandemic sort of interrupted the natural flow of what elections look like and made it difficult for us to compare. Then we moved to every voter receiving a mail, a ballot in the mail, and drop boxes in every county. So I think we need more time to see how the Voters' Choice Act works to determine whether it's successful. It takes a really long time to shift voter behavior. You cannot measure any of this stuff but immediately by participation rates alone, right? It's like an ocean liner. It just takes time to turn that kind of thing around. And as Lysing was saying, it's not just the VCA that's going to do that. There's other investment in other aspects of voter education and outreach that are necessary. I think successful implementation means that people are aware in their community of the changes. They know how to vote. They know where to go to vote. That's just those basics are really an important part of it. They need to know how to vote a ballot that's going to get counted. We've got to stop this. I wouldn't call it a hemorrhage, but a problem with vote by mail ballots being rejected once they are cast. They need to know what their options are. The fact that, this is really important. Some of the messaging that came out around VCA was, we are now an all vote by mail state. Or an all vote by mail county. We need to make sure that folks know that they can also vote in person. right? They do not have to say, the ballot gets mailed to them, but they've got a number of ways of handling that mailed ballot. And they don't even need to bring the ballot with them to the vote center. They could go to the vote center and vote in person. So simply receiving the ballot in the mail does not mean that they have to cast their ballot through the mail. It's very important. So those sorts of things, I think, would be elements of success of the Voters' Choice Act, understanding all the options. And to do that, as both Russia and Lysing were saying, we have got to resource both county officials and culturally competent community-based messengers who know best how to turn out their communities and how to communicate with their communities.
Thank you. Russia. So this sounds like a big question. I do not expect you to answer all of it right now, but why do you think we have not seen an increase in voter turnout in VCA counties? If I asked you to just kind of nutshell it, we know it's such a complicated story, as you've all already discussed.
So the voting rights nerd in me spent the fall really like analyzing Colorado. And I was trying to figure out what is Colorado doing. And so I pulled tons of data and was really looking at how are voters showing up? Why are they showing up? And I had to account for voting age population, voting eligible populations, and all sorts of other things. And my hypothesis after I walked away with that, and I've shared with our leadership, is I don't really know if it was only the tool that Lysang and Dora were talking about. I think there's other things happening in Colorado that make their turnout greater than ours. I think one first is demographics. Colorado is older, Colorado is whiter, Colorado is more wealthy than the diversity of Californians. And so I was thinking, are these diversity factors another reason why voter turnout is higher in Colorado under a very similar model but it lags here in the state of California? And so I was thinking, if I could just have more time to do like a really statistical, significant research on this, that would be great. But I kept digging, and there's a couple of other things that I was able to find. We understand and we know that research has told us that trusted messengers help reduce and help bring low propensity voters out and show them to come out. So we do know that trusted messengers work from research. The other thing we know in research is that it also shows that Black Americans trust local news sources as their trusted messengers, and they love their ethnic media. And so as I've been thinking about how do we address this, is it some sort of policy idea where we're thinking about local and ethnic media, thinking about trusted messengers, thinking about other programs like Democracy Dollars programs, and are we thinking about the panacea of other ideas to really think about how we support these low propensity voters and really turn that voter turnout? This is all like stuff I've been noodling on my computer with and writing about and thinking about. But if you're going to ask me like, what do I think we should be thinking about? I think these are the other types of reforms and the other ways that we should be thinking about closing voter participation gaps in the state.
Thank you. And Colorado started at higher turnout as well.
They did.
Being a swing state, at least at the time.
They did.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that makes your democracy geek completely 100%. If in your spare time you're going through voter data, which I, of course, think is awesome. Okay, let's talk, and we're going to go past one, as we often do. We're going to continue the conversation. So let's talk about the specific impact of the VCA on language access in communities. What have you seen, they think?
Yeah, so I think for VCA counties, I think one success has been that because there are fewer voting centers, there are less issues with bilingual staffing or poll worker staffing. And, for counties that haven't adopted the VCA, there are kind of more reported challenges. I think also on the flip side of that, with fewer locations, it can also sometimes be a barrier. So if you live in the Central Valley and now you have to drive a lot farther to get to your vote center, that can be a barrier. A lot of the folks that we talk to on the phones, they take the bus, and so sometimes the bus route is not as convenient for them, so that is also a barrier. But I think having more days to actually go out and vote and participate is helpful. And then I know there are a lot of like advisory committees like the LAC and the VAC that also people can get engaged in to really kind of increase that. I think with the task force, like Dora was saying, it was really a close partnership between the state, county elections officials, and community groups where there was a lot of advocacy around some of these issues. And I think that that's something, I'm glad that it's reignited again, because I feel like those are the types of conversations we need to be having to really make the process itself improved. And so I would say those are just a couple of things I would add.
Okay. And my hand is stuck, so I'm going to do this back. All right. So in September, a report was published, authored by, as I already mentioned, the VCA Steering Committee, the California VCA Steering Committee, a group of 7 civil rights and community organizations, including 2 here that are represented, California Common Cause and Cali Calls. Just tell us, just really briefly, I know I've kind of preempted you a little bit by giving that description, but anything else you'd want to add? And then next, we're going to move to Russia to talk about the actual recommendations from the report. What am I saying?
Yeah, I think a lot of the partners there are, either community groups that are working on the ground, talking to a lot of these marginalized communities, or civil rights groups that are kind of helping do a TA and support for this. I think for us, one of the core pieces in the report that we were really trying to look at is this participation gap and how is it decreasing this gap for marginalized voters. And so we really were trying to kind of dig into that piece. And I think, I think one piece of the report that I think is really important to lift up also that I haven't heard yet is just the data gaps that are present for Black voters, for AAPI voters, and for Native American voters. A lot of the times we're not able to actually identify where these voters are and kind of be able to target them to turn them out. And so that was also another piece of in terms of access and accessibility, there's a huge gap with the data to be able to actually close that gap. And so those are kind of some of the pieces that I think we were really looking at it from the lens of grassroots groups who are working on the ground. How is the VCA really kind of resonating with these trusted messengers?
Thank you. That was a lot more. Big description. Russia. So can you give us a brief overview of the key recommendations? There's a lot in the report. We think it's most people have said it's pretty user-friendly.
Yeah.
But can you just go through the actual recommendations for us?
Yeah, so the recommendations that really call me are actually tied to 2 findings first, and they're on page 14 of the report. That first one is that 3 out of 10, or 30%, of infrequent voters cite a lack of information about the candidates and issues as reasons for not voting. So they're saying, I either don't know enough information about the candidates, or I just don't have enough information about the issue to feel comfortable voting. That's 30% of individuals who are not voting on issues. 1 in 4, 25% of them felt that their vote did not matter, given special interests such as money and politics. And so when we're thinking about the recommendations out of the report, it brings me to the recommendation sections on the education and outreach pieces, because I think that there's an opportunity for us there to figure out how we're going to start messaging to voters that, 1, your vote matters, and this is why it matters. And the second piece is, how do we get the information that voters feel like they're lacking, either about an issue or a candidate, into the hands of the voter? And I think when I hear this information, I hear voters telling us, or non-voters telling us, this is where I'm struggling. And I think these are very clear opportunities for us to consider about, okay, how can we address where folks are struggling? How do we as philanthropy and CBOs and academic researchers and election administrators, how do we address where they're telling us they're struggling? And so those are 2 pieces of the report that I think that really tie really well with the education outreach pieces that the 3 of us have mentioned, of what can we do here to really turn the needle and turn this around.
Thank you. All right. lightning round. Last question. Yes, just a little pressure here. So, a minute, maybe two, if you have, you feel compelled. What do you think the future is for the Voters' Choice Act in California? And you can take that in any way that you want, right? About what counties you think will be adopting. Do you think there will be policy change? Where are we heading in terms of the Voters' Choice Act? And maybe as part of that, if you have thoughts, how do we ensure that the existing VCA requirements are actually enforced? Or is that part of the future in terms of potential change? Whoever wants to go first. I'm going to ask you a minute or two each of you. Lightning round.
I'll go in a row. We'll go down the line.
Okay.
I think first, more counties are going to come on board. That's just what I think. I think we're continually see that, and I think more counties are going to continue to adopt the VCA. I think groups like ours will continue to monitor the VCA. I think we will still be engaged. I think we'll still monitor, and I think we're still going to try to think of creative ways to get others involved to understand how they can participate in the EAP process. I think that we'll all still do that. I think that one thing that has been really exciting to see out of the Secretaries of State's office right now is this, their revisioning of their VCA Advisory Council. I think that's very exciting. I think there's a lot of future there of what we look at the VCA and how it's going to shape the state of California. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think that philanthropy is starting to show a significant interest in this, and not only on election years, but I'm starting to see an engagement from philanthropy during, in all years in the VCA, and then just voter access and outreach across the board.
I think.
Yeah, I think just kind of echoing what Brescia said, it's really for us kind of like we've already put together the policy and now it's continuing the implementation of it. It doesn't just stop after 1 year, unfortunately, and times are always changing. The landscape and, participation gaps are always changing, and there's always new studies and information around how to really bring these folks in. So I think the future for VCA is really like bringing back that task force to really work on the implementation piece. I also think another piece is just this issue around voter confusion and like the cynicism that people are really feeling in our democracy, and how do we continue to understand where that stems from and how to make it the process feel more authentic for most people. And so I think there's a lot there, both in terms of like studies that can be done to really understand kind of what are the barriers for voters in different demographics, because it's not going to be the same across each of those demographics. It's not going to be the same for low-income Californians and working class Californians. And I think, there's a way we've made a lot of really great policy changes, and now it's kind of taking that next step. It's when people feeling like they understand the policies that are on the ballot. They're not talking about how much money is being spent on ballot measures to confuse them. How many times have we looked at a ballot measure and thought, I don't even understand what this is about, and because corporations are pouring millions and millions of dollars to confuse us. And so I think that's kind of the next step, is really how do we bring folks in to achieve that authentic democracy.
Thank you. Dora.
Okay, real quick, right?
Yes.
Lightning round.
Lightning round, 1 minute. I should challenge you.
1 minute, oh boy.
That's not really fair. Take two if you need it.
So, I think the VCA is here to stay. I think it's already had a huge impact on elections in California. We're all getting ballots mailed to us now. We all have drop boxes now. I do think that we have a huge problem of democracy here in California. We are a minority state. Our electorate does not reflect that. Our representatives do not reflect that. And I think that we need to use every tool in the toolbox, including the Voters' Choice Act in counties that have adopted it, to try to, as everybody here has said today, shrink that participation gap and get everybody engaged in elections. In order to do that, we have to resource this work. We need to put money behind the Voters' Choice Act, but we need to put money more broadly in California behind voter education and outreach, so that trusted community-based messengers can make the value proposition to people as to why voting's important to them, why, how it's going to impact their lives, the direct connection between improved education for their kids, improved economy, jobs, and their role in civic engagement, and how voting for the right representatives is going to materially impact their lives. So getting money behind voter education and outreach for the VCA and for more broadly is absolutely critically important to addressing this problem of the participation gap, which is, I think, our biggest democracy problem here in California.
Thank you very much. So I think I hear, I'm not going to try to sum up everything you just said, but I hear a common thread that the future of the VCA, future assessment, understanding, whether it's meeting its goals or not, is intertwined with the question of how do we get a representative electorate, period, right? And how do we meet people where they're at in terms of why they're not participating? Okay, we're going to open it up to questions.
Along the line of trusted messengers, what are those examples of successful, collaborations with trusted messengers? And then twofold, how do we get trusted messengers to engage with the legislature, work in the legislature, so that when someone comes to bring those concerns, that they see themselves in the people doing the ground level work?
In terms of trusted messengers, I think some of the examples for us that we've seen work well, I think there's like the language piece, language access, as well as also just the constituency or even geographic understanding. That's been really key for us. And we've realized when we go out in the field that not everyone wants to receive their information in the same way. And so that has been really key. The folks who live in that community being the folks who are actually going out and doing the door knocking. They're the ones having those conversations, I think is really, really important for us in terms of the trusted messengers. And then I'll just say on the other piece that you mentioned, one of the barriers that we've seen is, we worked on a couple of policy fights, and when we talk to voters and we're like, hey, do you want to call your elected official and tell them that you care about this? And sometimes, we make 10 calls and the voicemail box comes online, and it's like we don't reach anyone. We don't talk to a staffer. We don't talk to the elected official, and they say, hey, stop calling. And that's where we also see this gap for low-income voters and voters of color who traditionally haven't been using these methods to communicate how they feel about policy issues like housing or around the climate. And so I think that there's a couple of pieces of how do we make it so that they feel like they can call their elected official, their district official, and say, hey, this is a concern I'm facing, or this is a policy I really care about, and they're able to know about when the hearings are, because a lot of the times they're from 8 to 4 during work hours, Monday through Friday. And if you're a working mom, they're not going to be able to make those calls and be able to share information about different policy decisions. So I think that those are a couple of ways that also help to achieve some of this representative democracy that's not just about the trusted messengers piece, but when they come to the Capitol, they see people who look like them. They also feel like their voice is actually being heard. They feel like someone's taking down that information and taking them seriously. We've also had calls where people, when I worked at the APEN, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, we did calls in Chinese, and we had to have someone translate for folks so that they could actually even be able to say what they wanted about a certain policy. And so I think there's a lot of access needs that are required, and that world can feel really far apart from voters to being here in Sacramento, sharing their opinions about different policy issues. Also, for trusted messengers, the creativity piece, we have our civic engagement programs and we talk to voters on the phone, but also people are really inspired by art and by culture. And so when they see on TikTok or when they see interesting content, I think that that's another way that we can really engage folks. It doesn't have to just be a mailer. It doesn't have to just be a voter coming to your door to talk to you. It can be so many different ways. And a lot of the times these niche influencers can actually make a really big difference in their region. And so I think that that's another potential strategy where it's we can get really geographically specific and bring in artists or other folks to be able to talk about some of these issues.
Okay, we are good. Thank you everyone very much for coming today. And if you've been a repeat attendee, we greatly appreciate your continued interest in the work and the talks. And again, please visit our website. Soon we'll have the recording of this session up with materials and links. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, my panelists.